Today we're going to bend some plywood and make a lounge chair. I started this project as I do many of my furniture builds by sketching it out full scale on a piece of cardboard. Designing a lounge chair is actually quite easy as long as you remember the critical distance, which is the middle of your butt to the back of your knee. Once you have that length established, you can draw angles and curves that make sense to you. And I just started cutting 18-inch wide strips, 2 at a time. The mold itself is going to be primarily made out of 3/4 inch thick MDF. I used my jigsaw to cut the MDF. I just went slow and made sure to follow the lines as closely as I could. MDF is really heavy, so I cut off the excess and I did it at an angle that'll later let me set up this mold on the floor. I used some scrap pieces of 2x6 to make spacers that will space the 2 pieces of MDF 1 foot apart. I want to be able to clamp these pieces of the form together from the outside, so I just screwed on some scrap pieces of 2x lumber to use as cleats. Now I started by screwing from the 2x side down into the MDF using 2-inch long screws, but that means these cleats are only held on by about 1/2 inch of penetration into MDF. I was worried that that wasn't quite strong enough, so I also drove in screws from the inside. The plywood isn't flexible enough on its own to bend around these contours, so I took some measurements from where the curves start and then set my circular saw blade to cut just about halfway through the plywood. I made a whole bunch of these cuts just about 3/8 of an inch apart from each other in the areas where I needed the plywood to be the most flexible. Alright, time to test out the molds. Now since I just cut them with a jigsaw blade, these forms don't really account for the thickness of the plywood in between them. I could have cut out a channel that was the exact thickness of the plywood, but that'd be too much work. So instead I just marked off a few key points that seemed to be pushing against each other and then trimmed those with the jigsaw. It turned out the cuts were so thin using my finished Diablo blade that just the glue by itself was thick enough. We let the glue cure for a full 12 hours, then removed the clamps and the forms and then added 2 more layers. With 5 full layers already glued in place for the seat, we are now ready to start the pieces for the back support. There'll be a center cavity in this chair and we didn't want glue to drip into it, so we were really careful with this first piece of the backrest. We used a whole bunch of spring clamps to really trace the contours before clamping on the other side of the mold. The first layer we just did by itself, just to really make sure it was in the right place. Once that glue had cured, we removed the mold again and added on additional layers. Alright, after getting 5 layers of plywood all set for the back support, we are now entering the home stretch of this project and we're ready to do the pieces that'll support the underside of the chair. I used my jigsaw to trim off these kind of horn-like pieces off of the MDF molds and set them aside so that I could reattach them later if I wanted to make another version of this chair. We then started the process of gluing in these last few layers of plywood. Initially we planned on doing 5 layers for the back and 5 layers for the underside support, which would bring us to a maximum thickness of 10 layers. I want the finished chair to have some flex in it, but not so much that it's going to slowly break apart the bonds of the glue. I took the chair out of the molds and pushed down on it and felt just a little bit too much flex, so I decided to add an additional 3 layers just to the underside. Alright, we're finally done with the glue up. We took the chair out of the mold and then propped it up on a sawhorse so that I could use a speed square and a circular saw to trim the edges. Trimming the ends of the chair gives me another opportunity to adjust the angle that the finished chair is going to sit at. The edges needed quite a bit of sanding. I didn't always get the sheets perfectly aligned and there was a lot of glue squeeze out as well. An orbital sander with 80 grit sandpaper is a great way to start and gives you excellent control without fear of chipping away a piece of the veneer. I then switched to 220 grit sandpaper and hand sanded out any little scuff marks that were on the chair. We then finished the chair with 2 coats of Varathane's water-based polyurethane in crystal clear matte. Alright, and now for the moment of truth. Let's see if this thing can hold my weight. Perfect, just the right amount of flex and it really nicely supports all of my contours. So bending wood was a lot of fun. I'm really excited about the potential for using this kerf bending technique to create all sorts of forms. I actually even think I'm going to take the forms that I made out of MDF and try to use those to make a concrete version of this chair. Thanks, bye.